Please stand for the invocation and the pledge.
Father, we thank you for this opportunity here today to represent you, Lord, in all that we do. We ask you, Lord, now to attend to business in a way that would please you. And so, Lord, we just ask your blessings upon us as we proceed. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I would like to call this public hearing to order. My gavel's not here, but that's okay. I need a motion to go into the public hearing.
I'll make a motion to go in public hearing.
I need a second.
I'll second.
All in favor? Okay, we'll get started. We're here today to talk about House Bill 581. It is a complicated piece of legislation, and there are many people who do not understand it. It has been passed down from the Gold Dome for cities and counties to decide what best works for them. We are providing you with 2 PowerPoint presentations today from our attorney Jody Campbell and our accountant Rachel Bembry for a better understanding of what all that means to the city of Statham. First, I did want to address some things that I've heard. We are taking away your homestead exemption. That's a big no. The council has already decided to opt out, which we have not. We have to vote to do that, and we have not done that yet. We have 3 public hearings that we have to go through. And when you voted at the polls, it was to cap your assessment at that time. It was not to cap your assessment at that time. It was to bring the House Bill 581 to the city for review on what that means for us as taxpayers. One size does not fit all, and all cities and counties all over Georgia are meeting just like we are today to find out how this bill will affect our city. We will provide you one more public hearing. Besides today, we'll have another one. What does opt out and opt in mean? We will answer that question for you. And one last thing that I wanted to say, no one in this room wants to pay more taxes, including these council members up here, who will make the decision based on our city. Take the time today to listen to Jody and to Rachel, and they will explain this legislation to you. Everything you will learn is based on factual information, and after the PowerPoint presentation, you will have time to come forward to speak on behalf of HB 581 or against. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them. That is why we're here.
Mayor, if you'll give me a minute, I'll get my PowerPoint up and running. All right, and if it's okay with the mayor and the council, I'm going to turn this way. Because the mayor and the council have already seen this PowerPoint, I figured it'd be better if I address this direction so that citizens have any questions, they can interrupt me. Last time I did this presentation, it took me 47 minutes. I'm pretty sure I can do better. So I'm going to see what I can do here. So we are here to talk about House Bill 581 and changes to the property tax assessments and homestead exemptions that was passed by the General Assembly. This is the second of 3 public hearings that the city has scheduled to examine and to discuss House Bill 581, its implications, and what it means. A little bit of background of where the legislation came from. The legislature entered into the 2024 session very concerned with 2 things. First, what they perceive to be reckless spending by local governments, and I don't mind calling out specific examples that were actually referenced in the news media. The Fulton County District Attorney's Office, the Fulton County Sheriff, the City of Savannah were 3 that were particularly identified as what the General Assembly thought, or at least the vocal members of the General Assembly were spending recklessly. And second, the rising property taxes that every Georgian was experiencing because of a sharp increase in property assessments. As your assessed value goes up, taxes increase naturally. And they were concerned that the trajectory, the rate of those assessment increases was so steep, and the tax bills were climbing so high that it was affecting specifically senior citizens on fixed incomes. And I will be very fair, that is a very legitimate problem. Our senior population has experienced a tremendous amount of financial strain because of those tax increases, and some are losing their homes, especially in the urban centers. So the legislature wanted to address these two issues, and the Senate and the House had different approaches to how they were going to solve that. The Senate wanted to put controls on the ability or on the assessment values and to basically put a cap or a ceiling in place to prevent runaway increases in property assessments. The House leaders took a different approach. They wanted to try to shift the role of ad valorem property taxes and decrease their importance on local government funding, and instead move more towards a sales tax model. They wanted more sales tax to be the primary funding mechanism for local governments. So House Bill 581 represents the compromise between the Senate approach and the House approach. The bill was incredibly popular under the Gold Dome. Once it came into final form, it passed the House by a vote of 164 to 2. It passed the Senate 52 to nothing. It was signed by the governor on April 18th, 2024, and it was ratified by a statewide constitutional referendum 63 to 37, not 73, 37. So basically a two-thirds vote. Two-thirds in favor, one-third opposed. This constitutional referendum was required. In order for this law to be applicable statewide, it required a constitutional amendment. So the voters approved that in the November ballot where you voted in the presidential election last year. I want to pause real quick and make a note about that two-thirds, one-third vote. And this is a chronic problem with constitutional referendums in the state of Georgia. As you can imagine, those constitutional referendum questions, respectfully, are incredibly oversimplified. Most times, the legislation that created that constitutional referendum are pages and pages long. This particular piece of legislation is 27 pages of highly technical tax legislation, and they just distilled it down into one sentence. And the way it was worded made it sound like, do you want to pay less property taxes? And I'm a little bit surprised that the vote was two-thirds, one-thirds. I expected it to be closer to 80-20. But it did pass, and therefore it became effective on January 1st of 2025. There are three major components to the law that I want to talk about today. The first part that we're going to spend the most amount of time on is the creation of a statewide floating homestead exemption. We're going to talk about what that exemption is. We're going to talk about who gets it, and we're going to talk about a city's ability to opt out, which is what we're here to discuss today. Number two, we're going to talk about a new local option sales tax that is very important to the overall legislative structure. It's the funding mechanism. It is the mechanism by which the perceived tax cut that was supposed to be created by Part 1 gets funded, where cities don't suffer massive shortfalls in their budget anymore. And then number three, we're going to talk about some procedural changes to property taxes in Georgia. Part 3 is automatic. The opt-out does not apply to Part 3. It's something that is absolutely in effect, and I just wanted to provide some points for the public's edification and education. Excuse me. So let's start with Part 1, the statewide floating homestead exemption. In order to understand this legislation, you need to understand the basics of ad valorem property taxes. It basically consists of two things. It's a math equation with two factors. Factor number one is the assessed value of your property. Now, to be clear, assessed value and fair market value are not the same. And this legislation makes that distinction all the more obvious. But your everybody likes to say, I want my property value to be as high as humanly possible, except in October. And that's why you sometimes will appeal and say, my property is not as valuable as you say it is. When in reality, we want our properties to be as high as possible and maintain their resale value. The second component is the millage rate. All right, so if you take your assessed value and you multiply the millage rate, that's what your property tax bill is every single year. Homestead exemptions are created by taxing authorities and are applied against the property's valuation prior to the application of a millage rate. A good way of thinking about this is your federal income taxes. You pay federal income taxes, you have your gross income. And then you apply all of these deductions and you arrive at an adjusted gross income. And that's what you pay federal income taxes on, that adjustment. Homestead exemptions are like all of those deductions. You apply it against the assessed value of your property, and then the millage rate gets applied. House Bill 581 does not address at all element number 2. It does not put a cap on the ability of a local government to increase its millage rate. Its sole focus is on factor number 1, the assessed value. That's important to keep in mind. So, what it does, House Bill 581 uses a 2-step process to offset the impact of these property value increases. Every single year, we'd hope that our property values go up. Our property is going to increase in value. That's not always true, but we'd like to think that it is, and it certainly has been the case in recent years. So, House Bill 581 uses a 2-step process to slow artificially that value increase so that we are now pay a higher tax burden. Step 1 is it creates a statewide floating homestead exemption for all local governments, counties, cities, and school boards. And it is, again, designed to offset or minimize the impact of increases in the taxable value of property. Step 2 is it caps property value increases at the rate of inflation. Now, that sounds good, but the devil's in the details, and I'm going to go through what I mean by that and why the words rate of inflation is not what you hear on the news, and it's certainly not what we're accustomed to experiencing. So let's start with step 1, the floating homestead exemption. And I'm going to use an example to illustrate how this works. So let's say your property has a taxable value of $100,000. Now, to be clear, property values and the way assessments work is the assessor is supposed to value your property and then multiply it by 40%, and the 40% is what you're paying taxes on, right? So I'm focusing on that. I'm focusing on the final taxable value. Let's say you have a taxable value of $100,000 in year 1. And in year 2, the value increases due to market forces, natural market forces, by $10,000. Your property is now worth $110,000. In this scenario, the floating homestead exemption would be worth $10,000. So for every dollar of increased value, you're going to get a dollar-for-dollar homestead exemption to make sure that you are not taxed on that additional $10,000. So basically, you'll be paying the same in year 1 versus year 2, assuming the millage rate stays the same. That's the math. 110 minus the 10,000, you get back to $100,000, so that's what you're still paying. Now let's say in year 3 the value increases by another $5,000. So now your property assessed is worth $115,000. The floating homestead exemption would increase by the same $5,000. So another 50. So now the exemption is worth $15,000. So in year 3, you're still paying on the same year 1 value, or what the statute calls base year value. Step 2 of this process is what we call the inflationary adjustment. So House Bill 581, the General Assembly recognized that even though this is an artificial ceiling, it's kind of a fiction that they've created, but the reality is property values increase by the rate of inflation, so too does the cost of services and goods that cities have to buy. Asphalt prices go up, pipe prices go up, and what have you. And so the General Assembly thought, well, we need to give a mechanism for cities and local governments to capture some maybe not all, but some of that value increase. And so what it did is it authorized the taxing authority of every city and county to increase the base year valuation by the rate of inflation that is determined by the state revenue commissioner. Now, I put at the end of this sentence, likely CPI, or consumer price index. If you watch the news, you hear a lot about inflation is this rate, inflation is that rate. What they are referencing almost universally is the consumer price index, which is published by the Department of Bureau and Labor Statistics. The consumer price index is what we experience as individual consumers at a grocery store. How much are you paying for a basket of groceries? The problem is, there's two problems with that. First, city is not a consumer. City's not buying bread and milk and eggs. The city is buying asphalt and pipes and the like. And those types of commodities, generally speaking, have a higher rate of inflation than CPI. So the point I'm making is that the cost of inflation, or the inflationary pinch that cities and counties will face, will likely be much higher than CPI. Now, why do I say likely CPI? The reason I say that is because the legislation does not state how the state revenue commissioner is supposed to calculate the rate of inflation. It doesn't say this is the math equation. So really, it's up to the state revenue commissioner's discretion how they want to calculate it. And because the state revenue commissioner is a political entity and a political appointee, that could change. So if, for example, if the governor's office went from Republican to Democratic, I could see adjustments being made to the formula and the way that the inflationary adjustment is calculated. And it's never going to be a fixed thing. It could change from commissioner to commissioner to commissioner. And so when we analyze this, we say likely CPI because for now, that's kind of a placeholder, but we really don't know. If it is CPI, obviously it's going to put cities way behind the eight ball because, again, the inflation rate that we experience when we purchase goods, commodities, and services is higher than what base consumers would pay at grocery stores. So let's use this. Let me show you how the inflationary adjustment works. I'm going to use the exact same example as previous. So we have the $100,000 base year value. We have the $10,000 market increase in year 2. We have the $10,000 homestead exemption. But in year 2, let's also presume that CPI is 2%. So your new base valuation goes up by that rate to $102,000. And the floating homestead exemption is reduced by that same $2,000 number. So the floating homestead exemption becomes $8,000 rather than $10,000. So your assessed value still is $110,000, but you are going to get $8,000 of exemption, and you're going to pay based on a 102 valuation. That's the two-step process. That's how they kind of balance this. And in year 3, let's say the property again goes up by $5,000. So our new homestead exemption is $13,000 plus is $8,000 plus the 5. We're at 13. But let's assume again, inflation is by 1.96. And yes, I used that weird number, so I could use around $2,000 for sake of ease. The new base value is 104 in this example. And the new market value is 115, and the floating homestead exemption that was 13,000 has to get reduced by another 2,000, so your homestead exemption is 11. This is the complicated math formula that House Bill 581 created to try to deliver on creating a ceiling on assessed values. Obviously, one of the most important parts of this equation is what is the base year valuation and how is it established? So for homes that are going to receive this exemption in tax year 2025, we are going to be using your 2024 assessed value. What does that mean? If you claimed a homestead exemption on a property in 2024, that will be the base year value that we're going to operate from. Okay, so the floating homestead exemption, the inflationary adjustment, that will be driven based on value increase from 24 to 25, and then the math formula kicks in. For homes that receive the exemption in later years, we are going to use the first year that you are eligible for a homestead exemption. So when a property is built, let's say I build a house this year in 2025, I won't be able to claim a homestead exemption until 2026 because we make those determinations on January 1 of 2025. And so next year in 2026, it will be eligible. That's the year we're going to set as the base year valuation. Similar to other homestead exemptions, that value can be reset, even though the house, in two situations. When the house is sold, so if you sell house 1 and buy house 2, you are setting the base year value based on the dollar amount you're paying for that home. Or if there is a substantial property change. What does that mean? It means if you add an addition. It means if you do a major remodeling project. And how does the tax assessor know? Building permits, electrical permits. So I want to strongly encourage all members of the public, you need to apply for building permits and electrical permits. Houses are supposed to be built to code. If you don't do that, you're not going to be able to sell your house. But understand when you do it, it triggers, we are required to report those things to the tax assessor so they will know that something is happening and they'll come out and do a reassessment and it'll reset that value at that time. And homeowners cannot transfer the exemption to a new property, so you can't take it with you. So let's talk about impact on other exemptions. And I'm going to say some controversial things in this slide, but I think that they are a financial truth, whether people like to admit it or not. So this new floating homestead exemption is in addition to, not in lieu of, all non-floating homestead exemptions. This does not repeal or replace existing exemptions. This is one of the biggest misconceptions of the law, okay? And a lot of people are saying if cities opt out, it means they're taking away homestead exemptions. That is not true. Your homestead exemptions that you have right now, including your special homestead exemptions, if there's a senior citizen homestead exemption or a teacher or a public safety employee homestead exemption, which I know some jurisdictions have, those do not change. Those remain. In fact, you are able to stack. I'm sorry. I'll get there in 1 second. Put a pin in that. If there is already a local floating homestead exemption, now or in the future, the taxpayer will receive whichever of the two exemptions is more beneficial. So whichever results in a greater tax savings, you will get. Barrow County already has a floating homestead exemption. It has had one for over almost 20 years. So this is not new. In fact, there's multiple jurisdictions. Fulton County, for example, has had one since 2004. This is not a new concept or a new creation. The only difference is instead of it being local, it's now statewide. And in Barrow County specifically, Barrow County will always, their homestead exemption, their floating homestead exemption will always be better than House Bill 581. Why do I say that? Because the Barrow County floating homestead exemption does not allow for inflationary adjustments. Remember how I said you're going to pay on a little bit more based on inflation? Barrow County doesn't have that inflationary factor. So your base year is set, it stays. So you get the benefit of no inflationary component. So Barrow County's floating homestead exemption, which you already receive the benefit of, will not be supplanted or taken away in this instance. And then what I was talking about a second ago about to put a pin in, the existing local exemptions will be added after the floating homestead exemption is created. Again, you'll be able to stack exemptions, which is already the law, already the case, but that doesn't change anything. So let's talk about the net effects on property assessments and taxation. This is where I'm going to try to distill down what I just said into the absolute nuts and bolts, okay? Like the most simple statements I can make about this. The taxable value of a home may only increase at a rate of inflation each year, set by the state revenue commissioner. Homeowners who apply for and receive county and city homestead exemptions will automatically receive this exemption because it's mandated by the state. There's no special application. Every year when you go apply for a homestead exemption, which I recommend you do every single year because eligibility changes every year and you want to make sure you're trying to take advantage of any changes to exemptions. If you apply for and you are given a homestead exemption, this one will automatically be applied. This is where I'm going to get controversial, that last sentence. This may affect what exemptions local jurisdictions offer in the future. What do I mean by that? Well, the current menu of homestead exemptions that local governments offer is offered, and they've incorporated it into their budgeting process. They know that after these exemptions are applied and the millage rate is assessed, they're going to be able to collect enough taxes to fund the operations of government, to provide the same level of services that you've come to expect. If this new exemption comes into effect, and if this new exemption creates a decrease in your taxes, then cities and local governments may have to take away some of the exemptions that they currently offer. Because, again, they don't have a choice in this one unless they opt out. If their budget gets pinched down this way, they may have to take away some exemptions in order to get it back up to maintain the same level of services. Non-homesteaded properties, i.e. commercial, industrial, and agricultural, will continue to be valued at the fair market value. House Bill 581 does not address commercial, industrial, or agricultural. This is only for homesteaded properties. So there's no artificial value ceiling that they create for this one. And now this is the simple mathematical reality. Since the floating homestead exemption slows the growth of value increases for residential homesteaded properties, it will create upward pressure on the millage rate. And that effect is exacerbated as the years go on. You're going to have a smaller effect in year one, but as that value climbs, but cities are only able to climb at a slower rate, they're not able to capture the value increases. And so over time, they're losing more and more and more in potential tax revenue. At the end of the day, though, the simple reality is, like I said earlier, the cost of goods and services are going to climb faster, conceivably, than the ceiling will allow for. And so if cities want to maintain the same level of services, but they don't get the value of those increases, there's only going to be one way to raise taxes, or enough revenue to fund the city's operations, and that is to raise the millage rate, which will increase taxes. So here's the controversial statement. House Bill 581 does not guarantee you a tax break. That is a myth. It just means that the mechanism by which the taxes are calculated changes. Instead of cities and counties relying upon valuation increases primarily to fund increased costs, millage rates are going to have to be raised in order to pay for those goods and services over time. Any questions so far? I'm on track to be under my time. Sorry, I closed it. I need to know what my time is. All right, so is this new homestead exemption mandatory? If a governing authority does absolutely nothing, yes. The new floating homestead exemption, it becomes binding until it is changed by the General Assembly. It is a Georgia statute. It is the law of the land. However, any governing authority may elect to opt out of the floating homestead exemption by following a procedure that is very, very, very close to what you already know when it comes to calculating millage rates. So if you've ever been to a public meeting or if you've ever read the paper, if a city wants to adopt a millage rate that is higher than the rollback rate, I'll get more into that in a second, we have to publish notice in the paper saying we intend to pass a millage rate higher than the rollback rate. We have to have public hearings, gives citizens the opportunity to come out and hear why and the justifications, and if they're not happy, they can express that. Same concept here. We have to have these public hearings. That's why we are having these public hearings. The local government must advertise and conduct 3 public hearings, of which this is the second, and later adopt a resolution. I want to address something that the mayor has already kind of alluded to. You saw in the paper, notice of intent to opt out. I hate that wording because it makes it sound like the decision has already been made. It has not. That wording is exactly what the statute says has to be in it. So I hate to say it, but the General Assembly was kind of playing games. They wanted it to sound like we had already made our decision. That is not true. We just, again, we're bound to put the exact wording in the paper just as it is written in the statute. And so we did that. But the purpose of this is to, again, be informative, to take feedback from the citizens. And again, ultimately, it will have to be the city council vote, and they'll have to make their decision. And the decision is set to be next Tuesday. So we're going to have our public hearing, and then the final vote will be then. But the decision has to be made by March 1st. More importantly, the signed resolution and all supporting documents must be in the hands of the Secretary of State by March 1st. So another fun component to House Bill 581 is it gave cities an incredibly tight window to have these hearings, to do their homework, to do the math equations. And I wish we could pilot a program and see what the actual impact is, but the General Assembly didn't give us that opportunity. We have to just do the best we can, reading the tea leaves, and make our decision by March 1st. So is the decision to opt out or stay in permanent? Short answer, yes. If you do nothing, you're in. If you opt out, you're out. Once the opt-out period is passed, there's no future method to opt out, not unless they change the law. If the local government does opt out, there's no future method to opt into the House Bill 581 exception. But, big asterisk here, local delegations can pass a local act of in the General Assembly to create a local floating homestead exemption at any time. And by the way, that has always been the law. Like I said, these floating homestead exemptions are not new. There are multiple jurisdictions that have asked for and received legislative approval to implement them, Barrow County being one of them. So that's all on the floating homestead exemption. Now I want to talk about part 2, which is the sales tax changes. Another controversial statement I'm about to make here is this. The idea of if you give a tax cut, you have to make up the funding somewhere, right? A lot of people say, no, just cut spending. Well, that's all well and good. And I'll let Rachel address kind of some of that, whether that's an actual reality without experiencing a decrease in service levels. But at the end of the day, the funding for a tax increase has to come from somewhere. And remember what I told you that the House wanted to shift toward sales taxes? Here's what they had in mind. First thing they did was they revised a statute that puts a limit on the percentage of local sales taxes a jurisdiction can levy. Because right now you've got your general sales tax, you've got your E-splost, you've got your splost, you got your T-splost. We got a lot of different one-penny sales taxes, right? Well, there was a cap in the legislation, in state law, that would not allow what I'm about to tell you to come into existence. So the first thing they did was they got rid of that. And the second thing they did was they created something that we deem, or we've been calling a FLOST, a floating local option sales tax. It's contingent upon jurisdictions having a base year value homestead exemption or a floating homestead exemption. That's another way of phrasing it. Either being in the House Bill 581 framework, or if they have their own local floating homestead exemption, okay? So let's talk about this new FLOST, what it does, how it works, and if it's a sure thing. So it's a new one-penny sales tax that is for the limited purpose of property tax relief. How does that work? Well, before I get to this bullet point that just came up, what that means is the tax revenue, if it's imposed, comes in. It is applied against the city's general maintenance and obligation budget, or M&O budget that we know of. And at the end of the year, we say, okay, we were able to defray the costs of the city's operations by this much money, and therefore we can apply that and make sure we don't have to increase millage rates. That's kind of the spread, if you will, or how it's supposed to work in theory. To be eligible to levy this tax, though, both the county and every single city within the county that levies a property tax must have a floating homestead exemption. Every single city and county. The county and every single city. So what does that mean? It means if any jurisdiction opts out, any single city in Barrow County opts out, every jurisdiction, the county and every other city, is ineligible for a flost. So one goes, there is no sales tax possible. Everything I'm about to tell you is completely illusory and not an option for Barrow County. So obviously, your decision making in a lot of ways depends upon the actions of people you have no control over, because there are a lot of cities in Barrow County that could make this decision to opt out. And in fact, many will. And I'll explain the politics of that in a minute. How is it implemented? It's implemented very much like a sales tax or a SPLOST, special purpose local option sales tax that you know now. So step one is this county and the cities that represent at least 50% of municipal populations get together and they enter into an intergovernmental agreement calling for the tax. The IGA is supposed to specify the rate, the duration, which cannot be longer than 5 years, and how that money is going to be distributed between the counties and the cities. Not to rip open any old wounds, but I will tell you that the negotiations between Barrow County and its cities over the share of property tax, or not property taxes, sales tax revenue has been confrontational, might be a good word. They can never agree. And every single time we go to the table for loss, there's always being made some. So the first part of this equation is, could the cities and the counties get together and actually agree on how it's supposed to be divided? Eventually they come around, but it's not a fun process. But then, even if we can get past that hurdle, it's got to go to the taxpayers every single 5 years. And taxpayers literally have to vote to approve that new local option sales tax, that new FLOST. You have to vote to charge 1 penny sales tax on everything you buy. Oh, and by the way, at the end of 5 years, you got to get a new referendum. You got to go through local legislation, new IGA, new vote. So basically, every single 5 years, you have to vote to increase your sales taxes so that you can give yourself a property tax cut. I'm going to vote to give myself a tax increase so I can get a tax cut. I'm sorry, but that's just taking money out of one pocket and putting it in the other. Mathematically, there's no other way to splice it. So the funds are used like I explained. They have to go towards property tax relief. It must be used for maintenance and operations. Can't be used for capital expenditures or anything like that. And each taxpayer's bill has to state the specific amount that your property taxes have been reduced because of the imposition of these taxes. So let's talk about the impact of floss on rollback rates. This is a highly technical slide, so I apologize if you go to sleep. I do not blame you one bit. So the idea of a rollback rate was created by the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, which was passed back in the 90s. And every single year, when you get your tax assessment value early in May or June, it comes out in April, but normally we don't get them until May. They get printed and mailed. You'll see what your last year's value is, what this year's value is, what all the taxes are going to be, and an amount at the bottom. The problem with that assessment notice is it presumes that the millage rate is going to be dead flat, that the same millage rate that applied last year will be applied this year. The General Assembly, back with the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, created something called a rollback rate that said what you need to do is if the property values go up, you can reduce the millage rate and still get the same amount of taxes. So what do I mean by that? Let's say the tax digest is $10 million in year one. Through natural market forces, it goes up to, I think I said 1 million. It goes up to 1.2 million, okay? In that situation, if you applied the same millage rate, you're going to get more tax revenue in year two. So what would the millage rate have to be to generate the same amount of taxes based on that increase? That's what the rollback rate is. The spread between year one and year two, the decrease, that's the rollback rate. The problem is that because there's a natural or an artificial ceiling, I should say, being put on those assessment increases, the spread between the millage rate and the rollback rate has now shrunk. Mathematically, that's a simple reality. Well, the General Assembly doesn't like that because obviously that looks bad. It looks like, oh, wait a minute, you're not getting the benefit of a larger rollback rate. So the floss was put in place to try to spread that back out, to make it look like the millage rate actually does get to go down a lot more than it really actually would. So here's my example. Again, 5 mills results in $1 million in taxes. Year two, because of increases, that rollback rate goes down to 4.75. You need to charge 4.75 to generate the same amount of taxes from year one. Because House Bill 581 caps increases in values, that millage rate and the rollback rate difference will shrink. And if the city receives proceeds from a floss, obviously that spreads back out. And your rollback rate the difference between the rollback rate and the millage rate will expand back out. So it's a little bit of a political smoke and mirrors, or mathematical smoke and mirrors, I should say. But that's how that is supposed to work. But again, it's dependent upon taxpayers approving it every 5 years. So some procedural changes. This is where I just wanted to put this on everybody's radar. Your assessment notices are going to look a little bit different. Instead of it looking like, here's what your taxes are going to be, it's supposed to put now, you're supposed to see an estimated rollback rate. So basically, we are having to calculate rollback rates a little bit earlier than we normally do. It's not hard to do, but it's just earlier in the process than we are typically accustomed to doing it. The estimated rollback rate is required to be on the assessment notice, replacing the previous year's millage rate. And if the adopted millage rate exceeds the estimated rollback rate, meaning if a city ultimately decides on a higher millage rate than what was on the tax assessments, every single tax bill the next year, the tax bills that come out will have to say it was this city's fault that your taxes went up. So there's a little bit of some public political tarring and feathering going on here. And they want, the General Assembly wants to make it very clear who's responsible for the tax increase. When, hate to say it, sometimes it was the actions of the General Assembly that sometimes put those people in that position. So I hate to be cynical, and this is just one man's opinion. This is not a reflection on the city or their opinion. It's just Jody Campbell's opinion. The game of politics these days seems to be more about creating enemies than solutions, and they just want to make bad guys. So that's what that is all about. Other changes, it modifies the 3-year lock for appeals. So taxpayers only receive the lock. If you've appealed in the past, then you've been able to lock your assessment in for a 3-year period. You can only get that lock now if your appeal results in a value reduction. It updates requirements for settlement conferences for tax appeals. And it also requires that the chief appraiser must appraise every parcel in a county at least every 3 years. My understanding from Barrow County is they've been running at about an every other year rate right now, but they're going to be required to do it. So that's really not a change that anybody here will experience. Policy considerations for local governments. This is where these are the things that the city council has to consider when making decisions about what we want to do relative to House Bill 581. Will the cost of goods and services outpace CPI and inflation? I've already covered that. I'm not going to beat that horse dead, except to say, again, the cost of pipes and sewer increases. I'll use this recent last 2 or 3 years. With, ARPA funding and a lot of the money that came down from Washington, we experienced, and every single governmental entity in Georgia experienced what we referred to as ARPA inflation. What I mean by that is sewer projects, water pipes, asphalt road paving projects. We were seeing that the prices that we were paying, I'll just say pre-COVID, versus 2021, 2022, 2023, were in some instances 60, 70% higher, realistically. And so even as bad as inflation was in double digits, it wasn't 60 to 70% bad. But the cities were experiencing some of that. Second, and this is the reality, House Bill 581, despite what everybody else says, taxes do not necessarily decrease. They only shift. They shift on type. They move away from residential properties, homesteaded properties, and onto commercial, industrial, and agricultural properties. I want to make two notes on that bullet point. So, if the property tax burden shifts away from residential properties and more onto commercial, industrial, and agricultural, commercial properties, and this is a statement that I also don't think is too controversial. Corporations, businesses don't pay property taxes. They don't pay any taxes, frankly. Any tax, they're a middleman. All the taxes that they have to pay to governments, they pass that on to the consumers. That's the reality. And so as their ad valorem tax burden goes up, you're going to see pricing go up so that they can collect the money and pay it. It's still coming out of the consumer's pocket. The other thing that this flags is House Bill 581 has a disproportionate effect on governments that have large residential digests. I'm going to use an example out in Jackson County. The city of Arcade, 97% of their tax digest is residential, homesteaded properties. So they don't have the commercial, industrial, and agricultural tax base to make up this long-term loss in revenue. So they're going to even feel more pressure on that millage rate than other cities might. And that's especially true in a jurisdiction like Arcade, where they have two very, very large residential projects that are about to come online, and their city population is about to triple. And it's all residential growth, not commercial or industrial growth. And the mechanism changes. Instead of cities and counties relying upon digest, they now have to rely more on millage rate. I know for a fact I spoke with multiple senators about this legislation, and one of the biggest things they hated hearing was when their constituents were calling angry about their taxes going up. And the county commissioners and the city mayors and city council members would say, we didn't raise your taxes. Your values went up. And we don't set the values. The market sets the values. Well, the General Assembly said, you don't get a windfall without some skin in the game. Problem is they put most of the skin on the millage rate side, not on the digest side. Oh, also, I should also point out, every single school system in the state of Georgia, every single one of them is opting out of this. Why is that true? Because unlike cities and counties, the Georgia Constitution puts a cap on what school systems can charge for a millage rate. They're capped out at 20 mils. And while I don't know of a single school system that charges 20 mils, over time, as that ceiling continues to chip away at their general revenue budget, they will eventually have to go up on their millage rate. And once they get to 20 mils, they're locked in. So there's two ceilings for them, whereas counties and cities are not restricted on the millage rate side of things. Flossed eligibility in other jurisdictions. Other cities that are considering opting out. This has not been updated. Winder, Auburn, Brazelton are all having these meetings. And I also will say we are in a unique situation because there's jurisdictions and cities outside of Barrow County that have bearing on us. City of Pendergrass has already voted to opt out. Arcade voted to opt out on Monday. So because Jackson County is now no longer eligible for a flossed, Brazelton has no incentive to stay in. And Brazelton sits in 4 counties: Hall, Jackson, Barrow, and Gwinnett. And so because Brazelton is on the path to opting out, there's several Hall County cities that are advertising as well. There's several Gwinnett cities that are advertising to opt out. Grayson, I've spoken with the mayor. She's 100% convinced they're opting out. Snellville, Berkeley Lake, Sugar Hill, they're having meetings. All of these jurisdictions are on the path to opting out. And it's all because Pendergrass fell first, and that created a domino effect Brazelton, and that's when all the dominoes started falling. I'm going to put, this is a highly technical point, but it's worth noting. Floating homestead exemptions would apply to special service districts. So in our code, we have the ability for large-scale developments to create special tax districts where, say, for example, there's a large tract of property, say the Walton tract that's out on 316. If they come along with a project that is enormous in nature and would require a significant increase in the amount of services the city must take on, we have mechanism where we can impose additional mills in that special tax district. So where, let's just say if the city charges 3 mills for residential properties, in the special tax district, they can charge those same 3 mills plus an additional 3 mills. The idea being, y'all are the reason why we need more tax revenue. You should have to pay it, not the existing citizens. House Bill 581, that homestead exemption, would apply even in that special service district. So even though we may charge 3 mills out there, because of the way that the math works, the effective increase would be 2 mills, meaning we'd have to increase millage rate throughout the city and not be able to pass as much of the burden on to the special district. And remember, if you decide to opt out, that decision is not final for floating homestead exemptions. If we decide along the way we've changed our mind, we want a floating homestead exemption, we can go to the local delegation and get a local act passed, just like anything else. I threw a ton of information at everybody. I am done, and I lied. I'm 47 minutes on the button. Dang. Again, any questions at all, I'm happy to answer them, and I'll do my best to try to be fair to everybody on it. Because again, one thing I do want to stress, what House Bill 581 was trying to achieve, I think is admirable. There is a property tax problem in Georgia, and especially being felt by senior citizens. Whether or not House Bill 581 solves that problem, that's up for debate, and I'm not entirely convinced that it does. But I do appreciate the effort to try something. I just don't think it's going to work. And I'll let Rachel explain why, if there's no other questions. Yep. Yeah, I'm gonna go grab one.
So Jody explains the kind of infrastructure of the bill, how it functions and operates. What I'm going to focus on is more of the impact from a local perspective, how it impacts and affects the city of Statham in its maintenance and operations budget. So to do that, I'm going to use the fiscal year 25 budget as my tool to show you what that impact does. Okay, so in order to do that, I'm going to spend 2 slides talking about what comes into your general fund budget and what goes out of your general fund budget, what makes those things up. So this slide breaks down your revenues by category. This is important because it shows your largest support to the general fund as real and personal property taxes. And you can see on the slide at the very top category, that represents about 29.5% of your general fund revenues. That's followed by sales tax at 19.8%, and transfers from other funds at 21.3% at the bottom there. So what this tells us is that your general fund relies almost solely on these three revenue streams. And it's important that almost 30% of your revenue in the general fund comes from property taxes. And we'll talk about how that compares to the state and other local areas in the slides to come. But the important takeaway is that you rely primarily on three revenue streams. One, changes to that revenue stream impact what the city's ability. This is your, and this breakdown shows you where the money goes. So we know it comes in mainly from three sources. Well, it goes out to primarily three sources. It's important to note on this slide that your largest department is your police department that provides the community's safety. And it takes a combined about $1.5 million a year, or almost 46%, half of your general fund budget. The next largest is public works, including roads and streets, at about $679,000, or 45%. And then the general administration comes in third, which includes your city hall staff, at about $515,000, or 15.7%. And I think the important takeaway here for our discussion today is that the police department and the public works department together represent 91% of your general fund budget. It is safe, and I'm absolutely confident that I can tell you if you alter one of those three revenue streams, you're going to impact one of those three departments pretty significantly. All of those three departments, it's safe to say. So it's something to consider where that money goes before you start taking it away and know it's going to impact those areas. So now that we've had a little bit of a reminder of where the money is coming from and where it's going to, I want to talk about how we develop and come up with what our property tax figure is. We don't arbitrarily pick a number out of the sky and say, well, that kind of feels good to me, or that looks good, or I like prime numbers, or whatever the case may be. We really do come about this from a thoughtful approach of what we need, because property taxes, the level of property taxes really should be determined fundamentally by spending levels, by saying, here's what my goal of services and I'm going to provide. Here's how much that costs. I can obtain revenues from other sources and take that off the top, but then I'm left with a gap, and I got to fill that gap with property tax revenues. And that's our approach during the budget development process as long as I have been involved here. And we spent a lot of time talking about it when we developed the fiscal year 25 budget, because this $3.2 million that you see here, and this was our actual thought process, and this is an excerpt from the handout during that budget development hearings that we had then, is that we say we have a budget of $3.2 million. We know in order to provide a full-time police department, improve our roads and streets, take care of our parks, and do things, we needed $3.2 million. And we had some debt service to pay along with that. So we take the other revenues that our general fund receives, things like sales tax, business license permits, franchise fees, things of that nature, which totaled about $1.7 million. And we say, okay, we can pay part of that $3.2 with that. We transfer some funds from our water and sewer fund, and we can pay part of the $3.2 million with that. And then we're left with $844,000 we need to find funding for. And the mechanism of government defines funding for is your property taxes. So, and then I can assure you this is not a one and done. We didn't start at $3.2 million. We take all the department requests and they ask for the things that they need and want, and we do this calculation and we go, whoa, that's a big number. We need to come down. We go back to the departments. We work with them on what's needs versus wants. And we whittle that number down as far as we can to get what we think is a reasonable or tolerable figure. So let's go to how this shortfall actually turns into a millage rate number for you guys. And that brings us back to that property tax calculation that Jody was speaking about, the math problem. You have two variables in this property tax math problem. You have the assessment value and you have the millage rate. Those are the two things that can change to equal what property taxes do. And that at the micro level is the same for a city at the government level, at the government-wide level. We have a digest, which is all those assessed values. We have a millage rate. You take those two variables and you get the property tax that the cities do, or our revenues. So we run through that calculation and we work to see where that millage rate falls out in order to achieve collections that pace of that $844,000 that we needed. And in this particular fiscal year, that number landed on 6.76 mils. That allowed us at our digest level and a 98% collection rate to tax to meet that required budget level of $844,000. So there are two variables, as Jody mentioned, the assessed value and the millage rate, and that'll be important here in a moment when we talk about House Bill 581 and that particular impact. Now, I mentioned in an earlier slide that we were at 29.5% of our general fund budget in property tax revenue. We try to just reduce the burden as much as possible on property taxpayers at every turn that we can during the budget process. But we also like to take a little temperature check of where we are from a state and a local perspective to make sure that we're in line with our neighboring and sisters type cities. So this is just a quick look at what that temperature check at this time looks like. Now, I would venture to say this is going to change significantly as people either opt in or opt out of a House Bill 581, because it is going to create inequities of how each jurisdiction applies property taxes. So we're not going to have these universal units of measurement are going to essentially go away or become less meaningful over time with House Bill 581. But for right now, we have the ability to take a temperature check of where we stand. And in the state of Georgia, the average is 27.1. So 29.5 is not that far off of that. And on the left side, you can see where I've included Barrow County's percentage, as well as just some other cities in this area and what their percentages fall out from their respective budgets. I am not going to go into the structure and parts of House Bill 581 that Jody covered much more thoroughly than I would have, and much better than I would have. I'm going to focus on the numbers for you guys and what that dollar impact looks like. So here's my example of House Bill 581, and I do think there's benefit to walk through it because it just shows it a different way. It's the same mathematical application that Jody used, but this is just shows it a different way. Some people read the presentations differently, so I think there's value in this. I'll run through it fairly quickly. On the left side is pre-House Bill 581. Let's say you have a market value. This is what your house is worth on the market of $250,000. In the state of Georgia, that results in an assessed value of $100,000. At this time, there is an existing $2,000 homestead exemption, which results in a taxable value of this home of $98,000. We apply the 6.76 millage rate, and that gives us a property tax due of $662. Let's fast forward a year, and we move into House Bill 581. At the top is a base year 581. If we opt out, this is how we advance. Your market value increases 10%, or $25,000 to $275,000. Your assessed value moves with it and becomes $110,000. You apply the same homestead exemption, and now your taxable value without House Bill 581 is $108,000. We apply the same millage rate, and your tax due has increased by about $68 to $730. Now, if House Bill 581 is in effect in this scenario, an additional floating homestead exemption would be applied so that your taxable value did not exceed, in this example, CPI of 3.5%. So we have applied a $6,570 exemption that will float to guarantee that 3.5%. So if your market rate had increased beyond the 275,000, that homestead exemption would float so that the result is that cap of 3.5% taxable value. So in this example, this 1 year, the savings to the taxpayer was about $44. Now, there are two sides to every coin, and I like to show both sides of the coin. So we've looked at what the savings would be from a taxpayer's perspective. I like to look at now how that would impact your community. So what I did was performed an analysis and ran a 5-year projection, and then I've extrapolated it out just for visual presentation. But I ran a 5-year projection of where House Bill 581 would take us, both if we opted in and if we opted out. Step one is just to calculate a 5-year average. So I looked back at the historical 5 years of property tax increases, smoothed out the rapid rise years so that we'd have a realistic projection for the next 5 years, and that average was 11.39%. So that's our starting point. If we take that and we say we don't have House Bill 581 and we assume 11.39% average increase for the next 5 years, we can estimate about $6 million in projected revenues over the next 5 years. That's step two. Then step three has given us a comparison. What would happen if we had House Bill 581 in those 5 years? So I let everything else have the 11.39% increase because, as Jody mentioned, that doesn't apply to anything but residential. But on the residential, I capped it at 3 to 3.5% for the projection. And what that resulted in over that same 5-year period, oh, my battery's dying. My same 5-year period is $5 million. So that's potentially almost $1 million in lost revenue over a 5-year period. I had to wake y'all up. This is exciting stuff. So that's a potential revenue loss of almost $1 million in 5 years. So a pretty significant impact to your community, and what I would consider a significant impact to folks on a fixed income. But when you look at it on this larger scale and we remind ourselves that this money funds at a rate of 91% your community's full-time police force and your roads and streets and improving those and keeping those in good maintenance, it changes the perspective because you can't take this $1 million hit and not expect it to impact those areas. Something that I think it was Councilmember Patterson actually asked me in the last hearing was, well, okay, that's $44 compared to $1 million. Not necessarily, because the $44 is just year one. The $1 million is over 5 years. So what I did was expanded my presentation by a slide that shows what that $44 extrapolated out, 5 years. So the citizens stand to save, in this example, $271 over 5 years. But your city loses potentially almost $1 million. So you just have to ask yourself, if this $1 million funds that 91% of your government, how much of that are you willing to give up? The last slide I have is on. That's okay, appreciate it. Can't see where the next button is. There you go. This is my last slide, actually. So what can the city do? There's a couple of different paths. You can opt out, continue existing levying and collection practices. You can opt out and identify and implement a homestead exemption to address the state's and communities' concerns that are applicable to your community. What the state's done is put out a one-size-fits-all. Well, the city of Statham, in all due respect, is not the city of a Fulton County city. It is not the city of Atlanta. So I would argue it shouldn't be put in the same box as the city of Atlanta. So that is one option. If you opt out, as Jody said, you can take local action to do something at the local level to address those concerns. Alternatively, you could proceed with House Bill 581, and as he mentioned, your millage rate will rise unless you cut the budget and the spending levels. You can cut programs to offset the property tax shortfall that will come with House Bill 581. You can work to identify or strengthen new revenue streams, but in a local government, that is limited. And I would submit to you that the administration is already aggressively doing 3 and 4. So there's that, or a combination of one of those 4 approaches to meet that property tax shortfall. But those are the opt-in, opt-out options that are on the table for you and the impact to the community, and I welcome any questions. Sorry. I had to speed up there at the end.
Now,
I just wish you had a printout of all this information, because I'm trying to take notes like crazy.
There is a recording of it there.
Is it part of this, what is house, is everything that you've gone over is all, is that all? Oh, it's in that one? Okay, I have not looked at that one yet.
They're online as well, correct?
yes, yes.
And we're going to be putting these presentations on the city website as well. So you'll be able to access these PowerPoints.
That new one I sent you needs to go out there.
Does anybody want to come forward to speak for or against? The podium's open for you to come forward.
All right, raise her back.
Well, you know, thank you, Jody. Next time I want to sell a car, I'm going to have you do it.
Could you state your name and
Adrian Mello. And you can put it on the record. I really don't like what you're doing. To me, it's voter kind of interfering a little bit. What you said, I agree with most of it. Having a real estate license at one time, like Scott, I understand a little bit of it, not much. Probably not much more than them, or not much less. I was sitting out there, and as your presentation, which was very good, both of you, and I was looking up there, and it seemed like somebody had their brights out here. There was a bunch of deer up there. Maybe, just maybe, I'm just throwing this out. And Scott can verify this for me. My house is only worth what somebody's willing to pay for it. And when I got holes in my street in front of the house, it kind of goes down. And there's been more and more holes every time it rains. That's just one thing. The other thing is, maybe, just maybe, when you're buying materials or you're hiring somebody to do something, maybe you should look a little deeper. Maybe you should get more bids. Maybe you should bring in more commercial. So all these houses being built that aren't even being lived in, and hardly any taxes come from it. And a lot of these houses they're building these days, they're pretty much throwaway houses. We're talking long-term stuff here. I don't think a lot of these houses are going to be around 10, 15 years. That's just a matter of fact. I know the city has a lot of expenditures. Maybe they have to be fine-tuned until everything else can come up to balance with it. And I'm not sure I feel real comfortable for, 2, 4, 5, 6 people making a decision on what my house is worth and what I should pay in taxes. I'm just saying. Just think about what you're doing before you make that vote. That's all I'm asking you to do. Look at everybody's side of it. And I believe Jody's been doing that. You know, you've been doing it too. And I know when you need this much money, it has to come from someplace, right? But nobody's mentioning what you can cut to get that point. They're just mentioning this is what we want to spend, so we're going to tax you. Well, I've been kind of noticing this past council's been taxing and spending quite a bit. And I've been noticing our rates have been going up quite a bit, whether it be water rates and sewer rates, whatever. But I think there's some fat you can cut out. That's all I got to say.
Anybody else like to come forward? Okay, if not, I need a motion to come out of,
Motion come out of public hearing.
I need a second. All in favor, show of hands. I need a motion to adjourn this meeting.
Motion to adjourn.
Need a second? All in favor, show of hands. This meeting is now adjourned.
I was telling her I have to now drive out to Jackson County to post 4 zoning